Hello. This topic addresses functional academics and all the components of what we mean by functional academics, as well as how to assess them and how to provide quality instruction in functional academics within the context of the school day and within the context of the school and learning community. The objectives, obviously, for this slideshow, you can read these yourselves, but to demonstrate understanding of concepts, identify areas of functional academics within the curriculum, discuss ways in which functional academic instruction can be integrated into the curriculum. So in other words, looking at ways that we can give our regular academic curriculum a functional twist and recognize the functional aspects of any curriculum. The two major definitions that we're going to be dealing with, first of all, is to understand what is meant by functional academics versus real-life skills. Functional academics are real-world application of core academic content and related skills. For example, functional math may be telling time, counting money, reading a bus schedule, those types of things. And functional reading reading might involve things like reading a newspaper, being able to fill out a job application or read a job application. So you're using basic academic skills to be able to carry out real-world applications of those skills. Real-life skills, I like to call these real-time life skills because they're specific competencies of local and cultural relevance. So beyond just the basic day-to-day functional skills in which we all participate that have some sort of academic underpinning, we also have skills that are related to specific needs in the environment in which that individual functions. So real life skills or real-time life skills may be an extension of functional academics, may be some sort of a change or accommodation within functional academics to match the environment in which the person is functioning, recognizing that that is going to vary from person to person. Functional academics, including career development components, these are things that may be included in that: functional reading and math, functional social studies, functional science. These may be areas you've never thought of as having a functional component. And then things that have to do with work readiness and career development. So one part of it may have to do with daily living in your community, in your local setting, and the other may have to do with developing skills that are needed for the workplace. However, there's often a crossover between those two areas, between daily living skills and workplace demands. So that's why we really discuss these within a double context. Here's some examples of functional language arts. I already mentioned some, but again, if we just stop to think about reading not for pleasure, perhaps, reading more for information, which is the base reading, why we read, we either read for survival or read for information. An add-on reason, a peripheral reason why we read, a higher order reason, is reading for pleasure. But really at the base of reading and language arts and reading and writing is reading and writing for survival, reading and writing for information. So reading the newspaper obviously fits within this category. Reading ads for employment. You're still using basic core reading skills, but the material that you're reading has a functional context. Completing an application, certainly being able to read what's being asked for, being able to write legibly and clearly and concisely on that application to be able to make a good first impression with employers is key and can be considered to be a functional reading and writing skill. Reading signs in the community, for example, might be functional academics or functional reading. because we are asking someone to be able to navigate around their environment. And this is where maybe some of the cultural aspects, those real-time skills, might come into play, depending on whether someone lives in a rural setting or an urban setting. The signs that are being read may look very different from each other. And finally, here's another example. Again, these are not all-inclusive examples, but the idea of writing a work log, being able to build accountability for how one spends one's time on the job. And so again, there's a lot of crossover because we have a core academic skill, which is writing, but it's also combining with a key work readiness skill, which is accountability for one's actions in the workplace. Functional math can take a lot of different types of applications. For example, money management, all the way from recognizing basic coins and their value all the way up to creating a household budget, for example. All might be considered to be functional math because it's functional applications for daily living as opposed to just adding and subtracting for adding and subtracting's sake, for example. One can just as easily practice adding and subtracting within a check register as one can on a piece of paper. What gives it a more functional twist is using the check register. It gives it a real-life application. Measurement applications. Obviously, things like cooking, for example, reading recipes, being able to measure where furniture belongs, anything that that we can think of that we actually would engage in measuring can have a functional application, and realistically, in most adults' lives, has that type of application as opposed to something that's more of a higher order math. Again, here's just some examples: budgeting, banking, buying food and personal items, volume, there's the measurement applications, volume, linear measurement, time measure, temperature measurement, and the dreaded weight measurement. Understanding what all those means, not only in terms of how to read them, but how to apply them to use in one's environment. Functional social studies is an interesting concept because now we may be talking about things like transportation, understanding how to get around one's community, being able to learn the public bus system, read maps, for example. Reading maps is part of social studies. Reading a map to learn how to navigate within a mall, reading a map to learn how to navigate in the community. Those would be functional aspects of social studies. Again, learning how to drive a car, learning how to access public transportation. These would be considered part of social studies. Community government, understanding not only what community government is, but also one's role within community government. What one's rights are, what one's responsibilities are, what the consequences are for not adhering to societal rules, how one votes, how one expresses an opinion in their community appropriately. These are actually things that we don't think of as being functional because they are a part of what we learn in social studies, but teaching them within a functional context that applies to the individual students' environments makes it seem much more real to them and gives it a context for their learning. Local and global geography. Obviously, when we teach social studies, we start at the elementary and we're talking about navigating your neighborhood. And then we go a little bit older to navigating your town. And then a little bit older, understanding that your town is part of a state, and then that your state is part of a country, and that your country is part of a global function. And that type of making that a functional type of content means that students understand that they are part of a global society, but also, again, that within each one of those contexts that there are rights and privileges and responsibilities that belong to that. Economy, being a part of the economy, being a user of the economy, and also being a producer in the economy, and what the economy means in terms of individual decision making. That could easily be considered part of functional social studies. Understanding cultural and linguistic diversity, obviously part of what should be expected that every human being should know. And so not understanding just only, as we would typically perhaps think of in terms of teaching social studies, that there are different cultures and that different cultures have different mores and different customs, but then also really understanding, building in the idea that that knowing about the culture is not enough, that one needs to be able to interact with individuals from different cultures in a non-judgmental in an appropriate way can be considered a more functional twist on that. Functional science, here's just some suggestions. Seeking a healthy lifestyle, planning nutrition and diet, first aid, preventing illness, recognizing signs of health problems, understanding sexuality, yes, because these children grow up, exploring career options. So typically we think of science as being, beakers and experiments and those types of things. But really, when you think about it, the idea of functional science is really understanding how the components of an environment interact with each other, how they are drawn toward each other, how they do not mix with each other, how to use information like nutrients and dietary and all of those things to understand what we mean when we're talking about how a body functions in biology, that there are decisions that can be made, for example, that will impact health. That might be considered an example of a functional science application. There's all kinds of assessments that deal with this, and in fact, in your textbook, they list several types of formal assessments. Most of these are assessments that really measure really first and foremost a type of adaptive behavior. How does one adapt to their current environment? And so again, those can be formal and those might be informal. Some examples of formal assessments, as I said, adaptive behavior scales, things like the what used to be previously called the AAMR, American Association on Mental Retardation, now the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. Those adaptive behavior scales have long been considered to be an important aspect of, or an important tool to use in assessing adaptive behavior. Adaptive behavior is really no more than measuring how well one adapts to his or her environmental demands, and that is a key. That's a great tool to be able to use to do that. And that particular assessment is normed from very, very young children all the way up to, I think, age 84 or something like that. So it's a hugely popular tool. Life skills instruments. Again, it mentions several in your text. We've talked about the life-centered curriculum in class, but also some of the other ones, the Kaufman, the life skills inventory. They are just things so that we can measure mostly through observation, perhaps through a report of others, sometimes through self-report, whether or not a person can actually demonstrate a skill. Obviously, the most functional formal assessments are those when we can actually see skills being demonstrated and not just being a self-report. Again, transition instruments, some of the things we've talked about with transition planning, the Enderleaf scales, there are many instruments that are available. Occupational measures, things that measure occupational interest, occupational awareness, occupational skill levels, all can be measured through some type of formal assessment tool. Again, there are good platforms for finding out information about assessments related to adaptive behavior or daily living skills. One is the University of Oklahoma Zero Center. Another is NSTAC, all the transition assessment information on there, National Secondary Transition Technical Assistance Center. They have a great deal of information on formal transition assessments. Informal assessments might be something as simple as putting a task before a student to see if that student can do the task. Um, It's a test with which we're all familiar. Authentic assessment might be asking that individual to actually do it in a real life context. So for example, if you want to see that he is able to do a certain work related task, for example, you can replicate that in the classroom, or you can take that child into the workplace to see if that skill is present. Teaching real life content is challenging because of what we are dealing with our pressures with meeting core curriculum standards. However, we need to recognize that if these are essential skills that we want children to learn, that we have a responsibility to incorporate those into their instruction. One of the things we need to do, we need to make sure that we have a full handle on a student's needs, preferences, interests, and students' preferences, interests, and needs, so that we are able to focus on exactly what it is that we need to be teaching the child or the children in our classroom, so that we're not trying to invest massive amounts of time in teaching every functional skill if there is not a particular need or undeveloped skill in that area that the student could benefit from. We want to teach within existing curricular structures. We know that we are tied or wed or kind of driven by the Common Core standards and the assessments that go along with those. So we don't have room very much to deviate from those structures. Some of the ways that we can do it is life skills coursework, which is actual coursework that is implemented within the context of high school diploma or non-diploma track programs. It's actually provided while the students are accessing the other aspects of their curriculum. It's aligned with state performance and content standards, but what we're doing is we are making sure that we are embedding that life skills content into the existing content with which we're working. We can do that through several ways, two primary ways. We need to, first of all, make sure that the content that we're teaching is meaningful or relevant, and this is what I was saying about making sure that it is relevant to that student, relevant to the environment in which that student functions, and that it have meaning to that student and not just be a random skill that that student is being taught. It has to have some degree of impact on one's life. Might not be immediate, might be in the future, but it's still an essential skill. Or something that we teach at a younger age, like simple problem solving, that could have a huge impact on future success in using self-determination. The content is meaningful and also timely, and has an impact on one's life now. So again, skills that a student could use immediately, not only in the future, but again, even relevant skills that are relevant to the right now still have implications for adult successes. A couple of the ways, as I mentioned, to work this information into the curriculum. One is through the use of augmentation, the other through the use of infusion. With augmentation, it means, for example, that you are teaching a reading class or a science class, but then you may extend with separate activities, separate assignments that apply that basic academic content to a practical application. So it actually augments, it does not deviate from the standard curriculum instruction. Rather, it enhances it, it augments it, it is attached to it or appended to it above and beyond as an application, a practical application. So for example, in science, if you were studying, fungus, for example, and then you wanted to do an augmented type of thing, then you might have an augmentation on cleanliness and avoiding things like athlete's foot. And what that means in terms of basic cleanliness. It's a practical application taught in an augmented sense. The other way is infusion, and that's really to look for instances within content that you can teach, that you can use a practical application. An example I used before was adding and subtracting. If you're going to be teaching adding and subtracting, for example, as a basic academic skill, then rather than use a sheet of blank paper with problems drawn on it, then why not enter the problems into a checkbook register visually, so that the skills of adding and subtracting are not being moved away from at all, but they are being done within a practical context. So you're looking for teaching moments, or what Jim Patton from Texas calls curriculum bursts, where every moment that you're teaching, you're asking yourself, is there a way that I could express this to the students, or have the students carry out this academic task in a way that has cultural or has functional meaning and has functional relevance for them?